Clara had always dreamed of escaping the crowded city life and finding a place where she could start over. The noise, the hustle, the constant rush, none of it suited her. So, one day, she packed up her belongings, said goodbye to her old life, and headed west to Arizona. She wasn't sure what she was looking for exactly, but she knew it had to be different from the life she had left behind. The Arizona desert was vast, stretching out for miles in every direction, with the sun beating down mercilessly during the day. The heat was intense, and the land seemed to go on forever without an end in sight. But Clara found beauty in the harshness of it all. There was something peaceful about the wide open spaces, the endless sky, and the quiet that enveloped the land. It was nothing like the busy streets of the city, and that was exactly what Clara needed. She had found work at a small ranch on the outskirts of a nearby town. The ranch was run by a man named Mr. Sullivan, a kind but strict rancher who believed in hard work and self-sufficiency. The pay wasn't much, but it was enough for Clara to live on, and she was grateful for it. Her days were filled with chores, feeding the animals, cleaning the stables, and maintaining the ranch. It was difficult work, but Clara enjoyed it. The routine gave her a sense of purpose, and she could feel herself slowly beginning to heal from the past that she had left behind. It was during one of her routine trips to gather water from the creek that she first saw him, the man who would change everything. Clara had been walking along the creek, her boots crunching on the dry dirt, when she noticed a figure standing by the water's edge. At first, she thought it was just another ranch hand, maybe someone from the neighboring farm. But as she drew closer, she realized this man was different. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a strong, muscular build. His skin was tanned from years of working under the sun, and his face was weathered, as though life had taken its toll on him. His hair was long and black, falling loosely over his shoulders, and his eyes, dark and intense, seemed to look right through her. There was something mysterious about him, something that made Clara hesitate for a moment before continuing toward him. The man stood with his back to her, looking out over the creek, his hands resting on his hips. Clara, unsure of who he was, cleared her throat softly to announce her presence. "Excuse me," she called out. The man turned slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, they just stood there, staring at each other in silence. Clara could feel a strange tension in the air, something unspoken between them. She couldn't quite explain it, but it felt like they were both aware of each other in a way that went beyond simple acquaintance. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice deep and gravelly, like he hadn't spoken much in a long time. Clara blinked, surprised by the intensity of his gaze. I'm Clara. I work at the Sullivan Ranch," she said, suddenly feeling a little shy. "I was just gathering water. I didn't mean to intrude." The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'm Kalani," he said simply, offering a brief nod in her direction. "I'm just passing through." Kalani. The name sounded foreign to Clara, but something about it felt right for this man who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. He didn't seem like the type to engage in casual conversation, yet Clara couldn't shake the feeling that there was something familiar about him, something that pulled her in. For the next few moments, they stood in silence, neither knowing what to say. The sound of the water flowing gently in the creek seemed to fill the space between them. Kalani didn't make any move to leave, and Clara, too, found herself unwilling to break the quiet moment. Finally, Kalani broke the silence. "You work hard at that ranch," he said, his tone thoughtful. Clara, still a little unsure of how to respond, nodded. "I do. It's not easy work, but it keeps me busy." Kalani seemed to study her for a moment, his eyes softening just slightly. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, his voice low but gentle. Clara shook her head. "No, I'm from the city. I needed a change, so I moved here." Kalani didn't respond right away. He just looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read. There was something in his gaze, something that hinted at a life full of pain and hardship. Clara couldn't help but wonder what had brought him here to the desert, just like her. What was it that he was running from? Or perhaps, what was he searching for? Before Clara could ask, Kalani turned his gaze back to the creek. "I've been through a lot of things in my life," he said quietly, as though speaking more to himself than to her. "But this desert, it's always been a place where I can find peace. It doesn't judge you. It doesn't ask you to be anything other than what you are." Clara didn't know how to respond to that. There was something about his words that resonated with her. Something that made her feel less alone in a world that often felt overwhelming. She understood what he meant. The desert, with its emptiness and isolation, had a way of quieting the noise in her mind. Here, in this vast and unforgiving landscape, it felt like she could finally breathe. "Maybe we're both looking for something," Clara said after a pause, her voice soft. Kalani turned to face her again, his expression unreadable. For a moment, there was silence between them. But this time, it felt different. It wasn't the awkward kind of silence that made her uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke of unspoken understanding. "I suppose we are," Kalani said, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara didn't know what to say after that. The conversation had shifted, and she felt like they were both standing on the edge of something deeper, something neither of them was ready to fully understand yet. She could feel it in the way Kalani looked at her, in the way the air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken words. But for now, all they could do was stand there and let the silence stretch on. Eventually, Clara knew she had to get back to the ranch. Mr. Sullivan would expect her soon, and the work wasn't going to do itself. But as she turned to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting, this brief encounter, had changed something inside her. "Take care of yourself, Clara," Kalani called out as she began to walk away. She looked back over her shoulder, offering him a small smile. "You too, Kalani." And with that, she left him standing by the creek, watching her go, the desert stretching endlessly around them. The days after Clara met Kalani were quiet, but they were never the same. Every time Clara walked out of the ranch house to carry out her chores, her thoughts seemed to wander back to him. The way he spoke with such depth and quiet strength, the way he carried himself as if he was always carrying some hidden weight, everything about Kalani intrigued her. At first, their meetings had been brief. He came by the ranch a few times, mostly to check on some cattle that grazed on land nearby. Each time he passed through, Clara couldn't help but notice how his presence seemed to fill the space. He wasn't the kind of man to draw attention to himself, but when he was around, it was impossible not to notice him. His quiet manner, his dark eyes that seemed to see more than most people, made him stand out. Clara, however, was determined to focus on her work. She didn't want to get distracted by thoughts of a man she barely knew. After all, her reason for coming out here wasn't to find love, but to find peace and a new beginning. Still, as much as she tried to keep her distance, there was something magnetic about Kalani that kept pulling her in. It wasn't long before Kalani started showing up more often. He would come by on horseback, and they would exchange greetings as he checked in on the ranch. He wasn't like the other ranch hands. While they worked with a kind of casual ease, Kalani always seemed to carry a seriousness about him, as though he was always thinking about something far away. His rough hands and weathered face spoke of years of hard living, yet his eyes held something deeper, something Clara couldn't quite place. On one such occasion, Clara found herself walking towards the barn when Kalani rode up on his horse. He had a tired look in his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. Clara had gotten used to seeing him with that same haunted expression, but she didn't know what to say. Instead, she focused on the task at hand, moving towards the barn door. "Clara," Kalani called out, his voice low, pulling her from her thoughts. She turned, surprised that he had spoken her name. "Yes?" she asked, trying to sound casual, though she couldn't ignore the flutter in her chest. Kalani's eyes met hers, and for a moment, it felt as if time stood still. There was a quiet understanding between them, a silent recognition that neither of them knew how to fully express. He seemed to be waiting for something, maybe an invitation, maybe an opening. But Clara wasn't sure what it was he wanted. "I was wondering if you'd like to go into town with me," he said, his words slow and measured. "It's just to get supplies, nothing special." Clara blinked, surprised by the invitation. She hadn't expected him to ask her to go anywhere, let alone to town. The thought of spending more time with him both excited and unsettled her. She wanted to know more about him. But at the same time, she didn't want to push too far. She had only just started to feel at home in this place, and part of her was still afraid of getting too close to anyone. "Sure," she said before she could second-guess herself. "I'd be happy to go." The trip into town was a simple one. Kalani had his horse, and Clara rode with him. The ride was quiet, just the sounds of hooves hitting the ground and the distant rustle of the desert winds. As they rode, Clara couldn't help but notice how naturally Kalani moved with the land. He seemed at peace here, in a way that Clara could only dream of. His confidence, though quiet, was magnetic. He was the kind of man who didn't need to say much to make his presence felt. As they entered the small town, Kalani led them to the general store. Clara had been to the store a few times before, but it felt different now, knowing that she was with Kalani. The town was small, with dusty streets and only a handful of buildings. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and strangers were rare. But with Kalani by her side, Clara felt like an outsider, like everyone was watching them with curiosity. Inside the store, Kalani gathered the items he needed, while Clara stayed close by. He didn't talk much as he moved through the aisles, selecting the things he needed with an efficiency that surprised Clara. He seemed to know exactly where everything was, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. Clara, on the other hand, had trouble knowing what to do with herself. She picked up a few things here and there, but her attention was mostly on Kalani. She couldn't help but watch him as he moved around the store, his every action filled with purpose. There was something about him that made her want to understand him better. She wanted to know about the person behind the hard exterior, the man who seemed so distant and closed off from the world. After they finished at the store, they walked out into the bright sunlight, the heat of the desert once again pressing in around them. Kalani loaded the supplies onto his horse, and Clara helped him, though she didn't speak much. As they finished, Kalani turned to her, his eyes softer than they had been earlier. "Thanks for coming with me," he said. "It's nice to have someone around who doesn't ask questions." Clara nodded, unsure of how to respond. She had never been one to ask many questions, but there was a part of her that wanted to know more about him. There was so much she didn't understand, so many layers to him that she could see, but couldn't reach. As they made their way back to the ranch, the conversation was light. But Clara noticed that Kalani seemed to be a little more at ease than usual. It was as if, for a brief moment, he had let his guard down, allowing himself to enjoy the simple act of being with someone who didn't demand answers or explanations. They rode in silence, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence that Clara had felt before. It was a peaceful one, as if both of them were content to simply be in each other's presence. When they returned to the ranch, Kalani said nothing more. He just nodded, and with a simple, "I'll see you later," he turned and walked away, leaving Clara standing there, feeling a mix of confusion and longing. What had just happened? It was only a trip into town, just a small errand, but it felt like something more. Clara couldn't explain it, but the day had changed something between them. It was as if the walls that Kalani had built around himself were starting to crack, just a little. And Clara, despite her efforts to keep her distance, couldn't help but wonder if she was beginning to get closer to the man who seemed to carry so many untold stories. That night, as Clara lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about him. His words, his silence, the way he had seemed to open up. Just a little. Everything felt like a puzzle she was trying to solve. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that Kalani wasn't someone who could be easily understood. He wasn't someone who would ever make it easy for her to get close. He was guarded. And for good reason. But Clara was beginning to understand that if she wanted to reach him, if she wanted to help him heal, she would have to be patient, just as he had been with her. The journey between them was just beginning, and neither of them knew how far it would go. But Clara could feel that it was a path worth walking, even if the road ahead was unclear. As the days turned into weeks, Clara continued her routine at the ranch, her connection with Kalani growing deeper, though it was still unspoken. He would stop by often. Sometimes, just to check on things around the ranch, other times for longer conversations that lasted well into the evening. There were still many things Clara didn't know about him, but she could tell that with each passing day, he was slowly letting his guard down. And with each small step, Clara found herself growing more curious about the man behind the walls he had built around himself. One evening, after a long day of work, Kalani came by the ranch as usual. He looked more tired than usual. His shoulders hunched, and his eyes were heavy with something that Clara couldn't quite understand. He was still the same man she had met, quiet and reserved, but tonight there was something different about him. Clara had just finished feeding the horses when he arrived, his horse coming to a slow stop by the barn. As he dismounted, Clara could see the weariness in his every movement. She was used to seeing him strong and capable, but tonight he seemed more fragile, more human. "Everything all right?" Clara asked, her voice filled with concern. She couldn't help it. Every time Kalani seemed out of sorts, something inside her tugged at her to help, to make sure he was okay. Kalani paused for a moment before replying, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "Just tired," he said simply, as if that was all there was to it. But Clara could see that there was more to it than that. She offered a small smile, trying to make him feel at ease. "Why don't you sit down for a bit? I'll bring you some water." "One." Kalani hesitated for a moment before nodding. As Clara walked to the well to fetch water, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Kalani had always been distant, but tonight he seemed different, more vulnerable. She wondered if something had happened to him, something that was weighing on his mind more than usual. When she returned with a tin cup of cool water, Kalani was standing near the barn, his hands resting on his hips. His long, worn-out coat hung loosely over his shoulders, and he looked like a man who had carried a heavy burden for far too long. Clara held out the water, and Kalani took it without saying a word. He drank it quickly, as though he had been thirsty for days, and then handed it back to her. Their hands brushed lightly, and Clara felt the jolt of electricity between them. It was just a brief touch, but it was enough to make her heart beat a little faster. Kalani looked at her then, his gaze softening for a brief moment. "I've been carrying this for so long," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara frowned, confused. "Carrying what?" For a moment, Kalani didn't respond. Instead, he reached down and unbuckled the leather belt that he always wore, the one that had become so much a part of him that it seemed like a second skin. It was a thick, weathered belt, its edges frayed and worn from years of use. Clara had noticed it before, how it hung heavily around his waist, almost like a symbol of something he couldn't let go of. But tonight, something had shifted. Kalani slowly loosened the belt and pulled it off, holding it in his hands like it was the heaviest thing he had ever carried. "This," Kalani murmured, his voice distant. "This belt. It's not just leather. It's everything I've been through." Clara's heart tightened as she watched him. There was something raw in his words, something that reached deep into her chest. It was as though he was finally admitting to himself what he had been holding on to all this time. She had seen Kalani carry so much weight, both physical and emotional, but she had never known it was all tied to that belt. The silence between them felt thick, like 1,000 unspoken words. Kalani's eyes were fixed on the belt in his hands, his fingers gripping it tightly. Clara wasn't sure what to say, but she knew that this was a turning point. Whatever had happened to Kalani, whatever he had been carrying, this belt was a symbol of it all. And for the first time, he was letting it go. Slowly, Clara took a step toward him, her gaze never leaving the belt. "You don't have to carry it anymore," she said softly, her voice gentle but firm. "You've carried enough." Kalani's eyes lifted to meet hers, and for the first time, Clara saw something like vulnerability in his gaze. He didn't speak, but there was a shift in him, as though her words had cracked open something inside him that he had kept locked away for years. Clara reached out, her hand hovering for a moment before she gently took the belt from him. As she did, it was as though she was taking away all the weight he had been carrying. It wasn't just the belt. It was the years of pain, the burden of his past, the things he had never allowed anyone to see. Clara held it in her hands, feeling the weight of it. And for a moment, she wasn't sure if she should just leave it there, or if she should do something more. But then, Kalani spoke again, his voice quieter now. "It's not just the belt, Clara. It's everything. The loss, the betrayal, the things I can't forget, the things I thought I could never let go of." He looked down at his hands, as though trying to make sense of his own emotions. "I've carried this for so long. I don't know who I'd be without it." Clara stood silently, holding the belt in her hands. She could feel the weight of his words, the depth of the pain that he had been hiding all these years. It was as if he had never allowed anyone to see the full extent of his suffering, always keeping it locked away behind that belt, behind the walls he had built around himself. "You don't have to carry it alone," Clara said softly, her voice full of empathy. "I'm here, Kalani. You don't have to do this by yourself." Kalani looked at her then, his eyes searching hers, as though looking for something he had been missing for a long time. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. And then, finally, he nodded, slowly. "Maybe you're right," he said, his voice raw. "Maybe I don't have to carry it alone." Clara smiled gently and placed the belt down on a nearby chair, away from him. "You don't," she said. "And you don't have to keep wearing it either, not if it's weighing you down." Kalani looked at her, his gaze softening, and for the first time, Clara felt as though she was seeing the real Kalani, the man who had carried so much pain, so much hurt, but who was finally willing to let it go. It was a small step, but it was a powerful one. And as she stood there with him, Clara knew that this moment was the beginning of something new. The man she had come to know was beginning to heal. And Clara was ready to be there with him, every step of the way. Kalani gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to let Clara know that he had taken her words to heart. And for the first time, Clara felt a sense of hope. Maybe they both could find healing. Together. The weeks that followed the night Kalani removed his heavy belt were filled with change. There was a subtle shift between him and Clara, one that neither of them had expected but both welcomed. It was as if something had broken open inside Kalani, and in the process, Clara felt herself drawn even closer to him. She could see that Kalani was trying to let go of the past, trying to trust, and, perhaps most importantly, trying to open his heart. Their daily interactions became more comfortable, more natural. Kalani no longer seemed so distant when they spoke, and he started sharing bits of his past with her. Though he never said everything, the wounds he carried were still raw, but Clara could see the effort he was making. Every word he spoke, every glance they shared, told her that he was slowly beginning to trust her, even if he wasn't fully ready to trust the world. But despite this growing closeness, there was still one thing Clara hadn't expected, something she couldn't have foreseen. The past Kalani had been trying so hard to leave behind came crashing into their lives one evening, pulling them both into a confrontation that neither of them was prepared for. It started when Kalani returned from the neighboring ranch. He was quiet as he came into the house, looking troubled. Clara had been preparing dinner, but the moment he stepped into the kitchen, she could sense that something was wrong. He stood in the doorway for a moment, his eyes shadowed, and his usually steady hands were clenched at his sides. "Kalani?" Clara asked softly, her voice filled with concern. "What happened?" He didn't immediately respond. His gaze seemed to be focused on something far beyond her, lost in a thought only he could understand. Clara stepped closer, noticing the tension in his jaw. He was a man of few words, but his silence now spoke volumes. "I'm fine," he finally said, his voice hoarse. But Clara could hear the strain in it. It was clear he was trying to push past whatever had just happened. But Clara wasn't about to let him brush it off. She had learned over time that Kalani's "I'm fine" often meant the opposite. "No, you're not," she replied gently, touching his arm. "What's going on?" Kalani closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, the walls around him seemed to have risen again. But this time, Clara wasn't going to let them build. "I ran into someone today," he said quietly. "Someone from my past." Clara felt a knot tighten in her chest. "Who?" "A man I used to know," Kalani said, his voice low. "His name is Elias. We had some business together a long time ago." Clara could see the change in his expression as he spoke. His eyes darkened, and there was a sharpness in his voice that sent a chill down her spine. "What kind of business?" "What?" she asked, trying to keep her tone calm, even though she could sense the danger in his words. Kalani took a deep breath, his fists tightening again. "It's not something I like to talk about, Clara. Not now, not ever. But I'll tell you this. Elias is the kind of man who doesn't let go of things. He's got a way of making people pay for their mistakes, and he's been looking for me." Clara stepped closer to him, her heart pounding. Kalani's eyes met hers, filled with a mixture of pain and anger. "It means he hasn't forgiven me for something that happened a long time ago. And he won't rest until he gets what he thinks I owe him." Clara's heart sank. She had never imagined that Kalani's past could involve something like this. She had seen the weight he carried, but she hadn't realized it was tied to something so dangerous. "Kalani, you don't have to face him alone," Clara said, her voice steady but filled with worry. She didn't know exactly what Elias had done, or what Kalani had done to deserve this. But it was clear that Kalani wasn't the same man he had been before. He wasn't the cold, distant cowboy anymore. He was someone she cared about deeply. Kalani shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "You don't understand, Clara. This isn't something I can share with anyone. Not with you. Not with anyone." Clara felt a pang of frustration. "Why? Why do you keep pushing me away, Kalani? You don't have to carry this alone. I want to help you." His gaze softened for a moment, but there was a sadness in his eyes that made Clara's heart ache. "Because if you knew everything, Clara, you wouldn't want to be around me. I've done things I'm not proud of, things that make me unworthy of your help." Clara reached out, placing her hand on his chest. "I don't care about your past, Kalani. I care about who you are now, about what you're trying to be." Kalani's eyes fluttered shut, and he let out a long, weary sigh. "You're too good for me, Clara. I don't deserve someone like you. You don't know what it's like to carry the kind of weight I've been carrying. And now, Elias is here, reminding me of all the things I thought I could leave behind." Before Clara could say anything more, the sound of hoofbeats interrupted them. The ranch was quiet at night, and the sudden noise seemed to break the fragile moment they had been sharing. Kalani stiffened, his body going rigid as if preparing for something terrible. "I have to go," he muttered, turning to grab his coat. Clara's heart raced. "What? No. Kalani, you can't just go. We need to figure this out." But Kalani was already moving, grabbing his hat and heading for the door. "Stay inside. Lock the doors. I don't want you getting caught in this." "Caught in what?" Clara's voice broke as she rushed toward him. "What's going to happen?" Kalani didn't answer. He was already out the door, disappearing into the darkness of the night. Clara stood there for a moment, frozen with fear. She didn't know who Elias was or what he wanted, but she could feel the danger in the air. Kalani was trying to protect her, but in doing so, he was pushing her further away. With her heart in her throat, Clara made up her mind. She wasn't going to let Kalani face whatever was coming alone. Not this time. He had already opened up to her in ways she never thought possible, and now it was her turn to be there for him. Clara rushed out the door, determined to find Kalani. She wasn't sure what she was walking into, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to let him face his demons alone. Not when they had come so far. Clara's heart pounded as she stepped into the cool night air, determined to find Kalani before it was too late. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the barren land. The ranch, usually peaceful and quiet at this hour, now felt ominous. Every step she took toward the barn felt heavier, as if the weight of everything that had happened in the past few days had settled on her shoulders. Kalani had gone out, running towards something that Clara couldn't fully understand, but she couldn't let him face it alone. She had spent so much time trying to get close to him, trying to understand the man he had become after all these years of carrying a painful history. Now, it felt like everything was at a breaking point. She wasn't going to let him shut her out again, not after everything they had shared. She knew she couldn't be the one to solve all his problems, but she could at least stand beside him, offer him the same kind of trust he had given her. She couldn't sit back and let Kalani fight his past alone. As much as he had tried to protect her from the world he had come from, she was ready to step into that world, to face whatever was waiting with him. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats. Clara froze for a moment, her heart skipping a beat. She looked toward the dark horizon and saw a figure moving toward her. At first, it was hard to make out who it was, but as the rider got closer, she could see Kalani, his broad frame silhouetted against the dark sky. Kalani's horse galloped toward her, and Clara rushed forward to meet him. She felt a rush of relief flood through her when she saw him riding alone. The tension that had been building inside her seemed to melt away as he drew nearer, his face hard and determined. But despite the determination in his expression, Clara could still see the fatigue, the burden he had been carrying. It was there, like a shadow, that refused to leave him. Kalani slowed his horse as he approached, his eyes scanning her face as if he had expected to find her still inside the house, waiting for him. Instead, she was out here, standing in the open air, just as determined as he was to face whatever had been holding him back. "You shouldn't be out here," Kalani said, his voice low, filled with a mixture of concern and something else, something that Clara couldn't quite place. "It's not safe." Clara didn't step back, though. She stood tall and met his gaze, her heart full of quiet resolve. "I'm not going to let you face this alone, Kalani. You've been carrying so much for so long, but I'm here now. I want to help you." Kalani's expression softened for just a moment, and Clara could see the conflict in his eyes. He wanted to push her away, to tell her it was too dangerous. But there was something in his heart that didn't want to be alone anymore. Maybe, just maybe, he realized that he didn't have to carry all the weight by himself. "I don't want you to get hurt," Kalani said quietly, his voice strained. "I'm not afraid," Clara replied, her words steady and full of certainty. "I'm here for you, Kalani. We'll face this together." Kalani didn't say anything for a long moment. His eyes searched hers, and Clara could see him wrestling with the emotions he had buried for so long. He had spent so much of his life shutting people out, thinking he could handle everything on his own. But now, with Clara standing there, offering her support, something inside him was beginning to shift. He had never let anyone in like this before, never trusted anyone enough to share the full weight of his past. But Clara was different. "I've hurt people, Clara," Kalani finally whispered, his voice rough. "I've done things that can't be undone. And I've run from them for so long. I don't know how to face them. I don't know how to make things right." I. Clara took a step closer to him, her heart aching as she saw the raw pain in his eyes. You don't have to make everything right, Kalani. You just have to try. You're already trying. And that's all I can ask of you. She reached out and gently touched his arm, her fingers warm against the cool fabric of his shirt. Kalani seemed to freeze at her touch, his breath catching in his throat. For a long moment, neither of them moved, both of them caught in the gravity of what was happening between them. It wasn't just a moment of calm, it was a turning point. A moment where both of them realized that they had crossed a line they couldn't go back from. I'm here, Clara said softly, her voice steady but full of love. And I'm not going anywhere. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. Kalani finally looked at her, truly looked at her. And for the first time, Clara saw a flicker of hope in his eyes, a hope that hadn't been there before. It was as if he had been waiting for someone to offer him that kind of unconditional support, to tell him that it was okay to stop running, to stop hiding. And Clara had just given him that gift. He slowly dismounted from his horse, his movements slow but purposeful. Then, to Clara's surprise, he took a step toward her and wrapped his arms around her. At first, it was just a hesitant gesture. But then it became something more. A hug that spoke of years of isolation, of pain, of regret. And in that moment, Kalani allowed himself to feel the warmth of someone who truly cared. Clara held him close, letting him lean into her. She didn't need to say anything more. She knew he was finally allowing himself to feel the one thing he had kept buried for so long: love. It wasn't a perfect love, and it wasn't an easy love, but it was real. And for the first time in years, Kalani allowed himself to accept that love, to feel its strength, to feel the safety it offered. I don't know if I deserve this, Kalani whispered against her hair. Clara pulled back slightly, her hands gently resting on his chest. You do, Kalani. You deserve love. You always have. Kalani closed his eyes, letting out a shaky breath. I've never believed that before. But maybe I can believe it now. They stood there for a long time, just holding each other. The cool night air swirling around them, the stars above seeming to witness the quiet shift that had taken place. Kalani wasn't the same man who had walked into Clara's life all those weeks ago. He wasn't perfect, and he knew he still had a long way to go. But for the first time, he didn't feel alone in the world. And Clara, who had spent so long searching for peace, had finally found it not in the quiet of the desert, but in the heart of the man standing before her. When they finally pulled away, Kalani reached for her hand, his grip firm and sure. We'll face whatever comes next together. Clara smiled, her heart full. Together, she agreed. And so, as they walked back to the house, side by side, both of them knew that their journey had only just begun. It wouldn't always be easy, and the road ahead would still have its challenges. But for the first time, they weren't walking it alone. They had each other. And that was enough.